Russia has, despite all of the successes that Ukraine had, a lot of advantages. Russia has more tanks, Russia has more artillery, they have more shells, they have more helicopters, they have more planes, and they have more people. The main Ukrainian advantage, despite all of the Western help, is still the fact that it's on the defensive. Being on the defensive gives you the upper hand in many different ways, but one of the most important things that being on the defense provides you is a psychological advantage. And we are now going to talk about the importance of psychology on the battlefield and in a war, and also why Ukraine is much more motivated than Russia. My name is Dennis. I'm from the organization Front Fellows. We are volunteers based in Kyiv. We support the Ukrainian war effort. And in today's video, we're going to talk about the importance of psychological effects in warfare, especially with regard to the current war that has been caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We shouldn't have any illusions. Many Russians, if not most of them, support the war that Putin and his government have begun. So it's not that the population in Russia doesn't want to go to war, that they hate the war and stuff like this. This might happen in the future, but right now it's rather clear that most Russians support the war effort. However, in many cases, this support is passive rather than active. Russians know that their existence does not rely on the war effort. Russia could end the war at any time by just retreating their troops from Ukraine. So this is not an existential struggle for them. For the Ukrainians, on the other hand, their statehood, their freedom, even their lives depend on victory in this struggle. So the odds for both sides are really different. The Russians can afford to lose, the Ukrainians cannot. But there's another reason why Ukrainians are much more determined than Russians. And it is that for the Russian, who has a really authoritarian worldview, they put their trust in the state. So they think their government is really strong. Russia has always done this propaganda. We have the strongest army, or the second strongest army in the world. We can do whatever we want. We could be in Kyiv in 3 days. So they just trust their government to do everything for them. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have learned, for example, in the Maidan revolution, also later, to self-organize. Therefore, when things don't go according to plan, the Russian will just complain and ask why doesn't the government do anything, while the Ukrainians will become active themselves. They will try to do volunteering work, they will organize in a village, in a city, and they will start to do something. This different approach means that even among the supporters of the war effort, Ukrainians have a much higher number of active supporters, while the Russians just support the government passively. Of course, this is an oversimplification. There's active and passive support on both sides. So when we talk about volunteering, for example, it's the case that in Ukraine, not just people who come from other countries, but the Ukrainians themselves have gathered a lot of money for the army. They supply things to the front lines, and similar things also happen in Russia. They just happen less frequently, and therefore we can conclude that the morale of the public is lower in Russia than it is in Ukraine. The clearest sign for the fact that Russian morale is lower than Ukrainian morale is the fact that almost from the beginning of the war, Russia had to rely on monetary incentives and then on forced conscription to generate forces. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, for a long time, they could rely on volunteers. They had more volunteers than they even could integrate into the army. So you could see that on the one side, there was the use of a lot of money and of force, while on the other, volunteers just came forth, they wanted to fight, and they were integrated into their units. Because of the fact that they have to defend their homeland, and because of a different mentality, Ukrainians are much more motivated than Russians. But what does this mean for fighting a war? Why does this make the Ukrainian army more effective than the Russian army? Most of the time, when we think about war, we imagine it to be a very physical game, like it's a numbers game and it's a game of technology, where the thing that matters is how many tanks do you have, how thick is their armor, how much armor can they pierce, what kind of optics do they use. In what sense can this maybe soft factor of morale influence the battlefield? Can it be militarily relevant? In his observations on Spanish affairs, Napoleon Bonaparte writes the following: "In war, 3/4 turns on personal character and relations. The balance of manpower and materials counts only for the remaining quarter." This, of course, is a really strong statement, but in this video we will show in what sense morale and psychological factors are important in war and how they influence the outcome of any armed engagement. Our discussion of morale will begin on the micro level. So we are going to talk about smaller scale actions first and then go upwards to the operational scale. But we will begin with the tactical scale. Historically speaking, almost all battles have ended not because one side was completely wiped out, but they ended with the rout of one of the two sides. For example, in medieval and ancient times, you had probably something like 5% casualties in the actual fighting when they were like shooting with bows and fighting with swords and spears. And then the losing side, the side that would run away first, would lose 20 to 50% of its men in the rout. Even physically speaking, the rout was much more decisive than the actual fighting. What you see in movies where like they are just like running around or fighting in these shield walls, it just took 5% of casualties. And all of the rest of people who died when one side broke. So the psychological factor in this time was immense. In contemporary warfare, morale is also a very important factor that tacticians and strategists think about on every level. And we will now talk about two things which are extremely important. One of them is the idea of suppression, and the other one is something that is sometimes called shock. So we will begin with a simple guessing game. In the Vietnam War, what do you think, how many bullets did American soldiers have to fire to kill, statistically speaking, a single Vietnamese soldier or insurgent? The number is 50,000. And in the Second World War, we have reported numbers of something like 25,000 to 100,000. In the recent wars that America fought in the Middle East, we have something like 250,000. These are huge numbers. And I think that most people who guessed something, they said something like, let's say 50 or like 200, but not 50,000. So how can we explain this? How is this even possible? Of course, a small part of these numbers can be explained by things like training exercises or mistakes in accounting. But even if we say that it's like 50% of this number that is just has been lost or has been used in training, we would still have a number like 25,000. And how do we explain this? Okay, one reason is visibility. On a shooting range, you have perfect visibility to your target. So you can just shoot at the target easily. It's sport. It's rather easy. Even untrained people can hit targets to a decent range. But when you're on a battlefield, you have something like smoke, you have cover, you have buildings, you have maybe trees or bushes, which severely limit your visibility. According to some data, the accuracy of a rifleman can be decreased by a factor of 10 if she's not on the shooting range, but on a real battlefield, moving, which will make you breathe heavily. You can't aim as well as you could on the shooting range. You could be in some concealed position where there's bushes or rubble or something, so you can't aim that well. But the most important factor is suppression, which basically means if the enemy shoots at you, you won't be able to shoot back accurately. So incoming fire from other people will make you fire less effectively. And this is something we have to understand before we can understand how truly important suppression actually is. If someone shoots at you, one of the things that will happen is that you will be stressed and you will be afraid of being hit. And this stress can affect your individual motor skills. So it might be possible that your arms begin to shake, or you're like in some way unable to just perform the actions, the bodily movements that you have to perform in order to shoot accurately. Might be that you breathe more heavily, which will make your aim go off target, or it might be the case that you forget some movements, for example, like reloading, or you drop the magazine or something. You do things less effectively because you're under stress, which will make you perform worse as a shooter, as a rifleman, or as a machine gunner or anything else. Furthermore, there's something called tunnel vision. So when you are in a very dangerous situation, like being shot at, you will develop this tunnel vision. You will be focused just on what is in front of you, so you might not see enemy movement in your periphery, which will make your shots less accurate. Because, for example, if you're completely fine, the enemy didn't see you, you're not being suppressed, you're not being shot at, you will see someone moving in a window somewhere and you can shoot them. But once you're in this tunnel vision, it's impossible for you to effectively track your targets and take them out. Moreover, when people are being shot at, they will start to prioritize cover over the ability to shoot. In the German army, there's the saying Wirkung vor Deckung, which means the ability to shoot is more important than being in cover. So if you have two positions, you have to choose between them. One is very well covered, but you don't see anything, and the other one is less well covered, but you have a very good field of fire. You would choose the one that gives you the ability to fire. But once you receive incoming enemy fire, you will intuitively move into positions which are more secure. So let's say I'm behind a window. Unsuppressed, I would probably try to shoot out of the window. But when bullets are incoming, I will spend more and more time just like hiding in the room or something, or in a trench. Like I will duck in the trench instead of using the trench to shoot at the enemy. So people will make this decision. They have to make it every moment, whether they want to expose themselves to fire on the enemy. And when the incoming fire is strong, you are very much inclined to prioritize your safety over the ability to shoot. Incoming fire also disrupts command and control. In a perfectly calm situation, your officers and NCOs can assess what you're doing, and they will, for example, say you shouldn't just hide in the trench, you have to shoot or something. They will control you. But once the chaos of the battlefield is getting more and more intense, the officers and the NCOs will not be able to control all of their soldiers anymore. So this will even increase this effect that soldiers will prioritize their own safety over fighting the enemy, because they now can't be controlled by their officers. The officers will maybe not even see them or not hear them because of explosions, because of sounds and things that occupy them. Also, individual soldiers will be occupied with other things. For example, trying to save wounded comrades, or trying to find the enemy positions. Like the more chaos you create on the battlefield by firing on the enemy, the more they will do things other than shooting at you. All of these factors together mean that those who are being shot at will not be very effective at shooting back. But this is not the only effect of suppression. Firing on a unit can also decrease their ability to move. And many of the reasons are the same as the ones that prevent you to fire. So, for example, people will prefer to be safe than to do what they're told to do. So if you have to attack position, you're being shot at, you go to cover. And if you go to cover, you won't move. So shooting at a unit will also impede their movement, prevent them from taking favorable positions, and therefore, for example, from flanking you or from attacking. This means that suppressive fire is especially effective to stop an assault. So imagine something like two positions, like houses or trench lines, and one of the sides wants to attack the other one and has to advance over some relatively open field with maybe some cover in between. Once they start moving up, and once they receive a lot of fire, they will basically get stuck in between those two parts of cover. So they can't move further because soldiers are trying to hide behind like small amounts of cover or just lying down to prevent being hit, and therefore they can't move anymore. This can also make them easy targets for something like mortars or artillery. So you suppress them with rifles or machine guns, and then you can hit them with indirect fires. We know that Russia had a big problem with finding capable assault troops that would still move even when taking fire. This is for the Russians one of the major problems, that they might be able to recruit a lot of people through forced conscription, through monetary incentives, through going to the prisons and taking convicts. But once those people are being shot at on the battlefield, a lot of them won't move up. So it creates a problem for the Russian generals. They can bring them on the battlefield, but they can't bring them to actually storm the Ukrainian positions. So suppression is one of the important psychological factors on the battlefield, but another one is called shock. Shock basically describes the effect of someone rapidly closing in on you, which is extremely distressing and can lead even to something like a rout. So troops will run away if the enemy closes in swiftly and in a determined manner. In ancient and medieval times, this effect was often created by cavalry. So you had something like war chariots or the medieval knights who would rapidly close in on infantry formations or on other cavalry to make them run away. So when you look at something like, Lord of the Rings, you see these scenes where riders are just riding through blocks of infantry as if they were made out of, foam or something. But this is not how it works actually. Like if you charge a horse into a densely packed mass of people, it won't do it. Like the horse won't attack a formation of people carrying spears and shields and stuff, or even like people who carry nothing. If they present the solid wall, the horse won't attack them. And even if you manage to get your horse to actually run into this mass of people, you will probably die, your horse will probably die, and you have also maybe killed some of the enemies. The actual effect was that the horses would charge the infantry and the infantry would run away. Like often they couldn't muster the courage to stand and fight, and this rapid advance of these large animals with people on top of them would just like make the enemy run away. In modern times, shock is still effective. I think the most dramatic example for this is the bayonet charge, which was used very frequently in the First and Second World War. You didn't even actually have to stab someone with the bayonet. It's more that you have this piece of metal attached to your rifle, you go forward and you show them that you want to close the distance, and this will be very distressing to the enemy. Most of the time, if they don't manage to kill or suppress you on your way, they will either surrender or run away. But even if you don't dramatically charge with a fixed bayonet, just closing in on the enemy, like for example in urban warfare or in trench warfare, will have a big psychological effect. A lot of units would rather take high casualties by fire than to be exposed at close range by someone who is basically running towards you or who's throwing grenades, who's in really close proximity, because it triggers some kind of more primal fear in humans that will make them just either run or surrender. Shock and suppression are most effective when used together. So you first shoot at the enemy to suppress them, and then you assault them or flank them to dislodge them from their positions. This is the standard approach that most armies use when faced with, for example, an infantry opponent, to defeat them with this combination of fire and maneuver. And actually, this approach is rather old. The Mongols, for example, used mounted archers or horse archers to shoot arrows at their enemies, and once they think they're suppressed, they would use heavy cavalry with lances and armored horses to drive them away and to defeat them. In the Napoleonic Wars, there was something called a mixed order that the French used. So they had a line of soldiers, of professional soldiers from the old Ancien Regime army, and they would engage in a firefight with the enemy. Once the enemy is suppressed sufficiently, on the flanks they had columns of conscripts, or like fiery revolutionary, people who wanted to defeat the tyranny of the old regime, and they would use bayonets to attack and to drive the enemy away. So you had this suppression phase first, and then you had a shock attack. On a more macro level, Napoleon did this with his cannon as a suppressive weapon, and then cavalry like the cuirassier as a shock weapon. So in a modern battle, you have something like machine guns, autocannons, tank cannon, and artillery to deal the suppression, and then you have infantry for the shock action. So it's not just a physical contest, it's also a contest of who will, for example, get suppressed first. If you have a Ukrainian and a Russian unit and they shoot at each other, if one unit starts to prioritize cover first and their fire becomes less effective, then this has a kind of feedback effect. So let's say the Russians break first, they start going to cover, the Ukrainians now are less suppressed because they receive less accurate fire and they can fire even more effectively, which makes the Russian go to cover even more. And so it's like a feedback effect where the initial advantage of the more courageous side will be amplified over time. So on the tactical level, when you think about things like suppression and shock, you can clearly see that if the Ukrainians are in general more courageous, then they have an advantage over the Russian enemies. Even if the Russians use better equipment or if they have more troops, more tanks, more shells, something like that. But psychological effects are not only important on the tactical level, but also on the operational level. If you think about a whole army, like a whole division maybe, or like a corps, then you can have something like a mass rout. And we've seen this in the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive. When it hit the Russians, there was panic among the Russian ranks, and not just among troops on the front line, but also among units which were not even engaged in combat. So they just were receiving messages about Ukrainian attacks, about advances by Ukraine, and they started to panic. They left their equipment, they ran away, they tried to hide in the forests. The complete discipline and order of the Russian forces in the Kharkiv region collapsed. When you look at the Kherson campaign, on the other hand, you can see an ordered Russian retreat. So here, operationally, the Russians maintained their discipline and therefore they didn't lose hundreds of tanks and vehicles. They were able to take most of their stuff with them and to safeguard the integrity of their troops. Morale on the operational level of war is clearly very important, but the question is, why do some armies retreat in a very chaotic manner and others manage to, keep their order and slowly go back without losing everything they have? So imagine you're not engaged in combat. You're part of an army and you just hear about other parts of your side's troops being attacked and being destroyed. What do you think? So you might think something like this. Okay, now we are losing and the enemy is coming to attack us, to encircle us. Our commanders don't know what they do and I have to get out of here because now maybe I can still flee. But maybe in 1 hour or in 2 hours, the enemy is already here. They have encircled us. There's no way to flee. They've destroyed the bridges. Our commanders will forget us. Now is the moment for me to run away. And this is what a lot of Russian soldiers believed in the Kharkiv offensive. So the discipline of the army collapsed. This effect is especially strong if you think that others are already running. So you don't want to be like the idiot who fights until death while other units are just running away and they're even using you as some kind of, as someone who will slow down the enemy while they just get into safety. If you see your commanders running away, it's completely clear that, okay, yeah, they've abandoned you, so probably you should also run. And even if you don't see them retreating, if your opinion about those troops is maybe low, if you think, yeah, I'm just a lowly Russian conscript and I know that the other units that are like to the left and to the right of our position, they are also just some Mobics and they don't know what they're doing and they are probably running right now, yeah, then I should also be running. But if you think, okay, now I'm a Ukrainian soldier in an elite unit. I know that we are fighting for our country and I just can't believe that the people from the other brigade that they are running. So I can't leave them and I can't be the one, our unit can't be the one that fucks everything up. So we have to stand and fight. So it very much also depends on your opinion about the other units and whether you think they will run or they will fight. When it comes to routes, contagion is just a very important factor. If you see someone else running away, you will do the same thing. If you think other units are abandoning their positions, they are moving to the back, then it's very probable that your unit will do the same. But if you think that the others are going to stand and fight, then even if you think, oh yeah, that's really dangerous, you will also stand and fight. If and when a big Ukrainian counteroffensive happens, one of the most important things will be the reaction of the Russian soldiers. Upon receiving the initial blow, maybe some Ukrainian breakthroughs, they could either stand and fight, or they could completely collapse. And if they collapse, then Ukraine has a very high chance to capture a lot of ground, to capture a lot of equipment without losing many people, because this kind of wave of contagion will move through the Russian army, and everyone will think, if I don't get out now, I will become a prisoner or I will be killed. So that is all we have to say for now about the impact of psychological factors on war. And it's an area that in general favors the Ukrainian side. There are some highly motivated units on the Russian side, but in general we can observe that their standard of psychological fortitude is lower than the one of the Ukrainians. But this of course doesn't mean that material factors are irrelevant. No matter how courageous your soldiers are, they need equipment, they need weapons, they need the firepower to kill the enemy. So please support Ukraine, support us, the Front Fellows, or support some other volunteer organization, but do something to give the soldiers of Ukraine the ability to strike back at the invaders. Thank you very much.